All right, what's up, everyone? We are back for now the Computational Philosophy Club. Today, we are joined by Professor William Edward Hahn, who really needs no introduction at this point, since most people have probably already heard about him. But he's going to be talking about some really interesting stuff today, which is sort of a precursor to the hackathon that Ecolapto and the club are collaborating on. It's called the Longevity Hackathon, sort of boringly, but the topics are going to be on the phenomenology of longevity, the quality of what it actually feels like to be healthier and all that. Dr. Hahn over here is going to be talking about biological info hazards and how it relates to disease, illness, longevity, all that kind of jazz. What does it feel like to be 150? Well, there's a good 150 and then there's a bad 150. In the future, they're going to say 150 is the new 100. So ideally we could feel like 50 at 150, but we'll see where it goes. Um, Anyways, I think people already sort of know who I am and what I'm working on. A little quick shout before we also start. Dr. William Hahn and Dr. Lon Barinholtz are going to be doing a virtual keynote at Ecolapto's first salon, Polymath Salon in SF in the Bay Area. I'm not even physically going to be there. It's actually going to be run by Dugan in person from the Wolfram Institute. And then him and Andres will be talking in person and doing like a live Q&A and all that kinds of stuff. But anyways, yeah, things are going great. Ecolapto's got a lot planned, and the Computational Philosophy Club as well. You'll find out more information about the hackathon soon. But right now, let's just get straight into Dr. Hahn's keynote. Take it away, man.
Awesome. Well, thanks again to Ecolapto for putting this together. Really happy to be here to tell you about some of the ideas I've been
and
kicking
the
around.
Computational Philosophy Club.
And the Computational Philosophy Club, of course. Super excited to be kicking this thing off. Really amazing group of people that you've got here. So these are some ideas that I've been kicking around. Some of you guys have heard before, but I put some new takes in here of things I've been thinking about, in that we need to rethink biology in terms of information. Right? Information is really a relatively new idea. Computation itself, as we'll see, is a relatively new idea. And so we need to kind of consider these as we look at sort of the open questions, whether it's cancer or aging, longevity in general. Okay, so before I forget, I want to mention this is kind of a teaser for the hackathon that's going to be on October 17th. So you can see the link on screen for that. And we're going to have some really interesting folks there, including Lon Barinholtz, Andre, and QRI. So this is going to be a really exciting event. So make sure you get that on your calendar. So this is going to be kind of some introduction to some of these ideas. So really, in a nutshell, is that we have this whole new vocabulary. We have a whole new paradigm. It's kind of in our faces every day. We live and breathe through these telephones. Unfortunately, almost all of our work is done through the internet, and now increasingly through these large language models and AI tools that have become ubiquitous. But I would argue that that viewpoint or that paradigm is still underrepresented in biological research, and in particular education, when we think of things like medical school or just advanced bio or chemistry research. And so I kind of wanted to engage the group today to explore this idea and think about this signal, where it's not the physics of the thing that's hurting you. It's not the chemistry, it's the pattern. And so we're going to look at more of kind of what that means. So we have some information hazards in general in biology. Typically, when people talk about information hazards, they're often referring to the design for a nuclear weapon or the design for biological or chemical weapons. And that's dangerous information. It's hazardous information. And we don't want that to just be sitting there on a library bookshelf. But this is information hazard in a different sort of way. This is about data poisoning. This is about disrupting a system, but not through the usual physics or forces kind of metaphor, but by thinking of it as disrupting a kind of computational process. And so some examples of this would be like prions, things like mad cow disease, where they literally are kind of a self-replicating shape. It's a protein fragment that will make copies of itself kind of endlessly. And this becomes a big issue in your biology. It's thought that things like Alzheimer's disease and some kinds of neurodegenerative disorders are actually of this type, where you have this kind of self-replicating process where it's not a virus or a bacteria in the normal sort of way. It's more just like a bug in the code itself. And then very similar to this would be kind of the viruses. But it seems like the classical virus theory is a little bit different because the virus has this information payload. It's learning things on an evolutionary scale, and it's taking what it's learned on this adaptive engine that we would call evolution, and it's encoding that in its own sequence. And so the virus is kind of learning. This is very different than the prion, because the prion isn't accruing this knowledge base. It just happens to be a failure mode in the way our biochemistry works. And the same kind of thing with epigenetics. There's interesting ideas now emerging where people look at populations and they look at things like obesity, and they try to understand why a certain population is more susceptible to that. And some of the explanations have to do with previous generations suffering famine, and that the information about the famine was stored not in the DNA, but in this kind of this milieu, this sauce, let's call it, that's in and around the cells. This is a lot of what Michael Levin works on the electrical front, exploring how the cells are keeping track of information in an electrical form on the surface of the cell. So we need to rethink these scenarios in biology and try to understand them using some of the terms that we have now, or some of the thinking tools that we have now from the modern technological world, essentially. And then in particular with aging, which I really believe is going to be one of the killer applications, or rather life-saving applications of artificial intelligence, to go through and better understand the interactome, to better understand the environmental, the genetics, all these systems are all intertwined and cross-connected, and we need a more advanced system to piece that apart. And I think that AI is definitely going to do this. We've seen a little bit of this with things like DeepFold, where we're getting better protein models, and now with like entire cells are just at the cusp of being modeled with the kind of systems that we see with modern AI. So this idea of like software that governs life, to see biology as a kind of computer program, and just like other computer programs that we're familiar with on our laptops and our phones, we know that those sort of go bad after a while. Very few people use a laptop that's 10 or 15 years old. And it's not because the chip isn't fast enough anymore. It's largely because the system is out of whack, that it doesn't operate the same as when you opened it for the first time. And that's kind of how aging could be thought of, is that the system has these error correction and these kind of compensating mechanisms, but eventually the error correction kind of wears out, and the system is no longer able to make these course corrections. And this is kind of what we see with aging. So we need to redefine a biological hazard from just, rather than thinking of just like, oh, this chemical hurts you, or this bacteria hurts you. Well, it's weirder than that, because if you get a bacteria, they're very small, right? They can pump out all the toxins they want. They're not going to affect a system of your scale. And so bacteria know this. On the evolutionary scale, they team up, and they do things like quorum sensing and very sophisticated coordinated attacks against your immune system, because if a single bacteria were to attack, so to speak, your immune system would clobber it. So there's this very interesting kind of higher level warfare that's happening in our immune system that's not very well understood. So that's kind of the first layer of thinking about disease as having more intelligence than just, oh, it got through your skin, or it got through your nose and into your body. It then can often sit and wait in sort of a sleeper cell fashion with this quorum sensing. And this is only discovered in the last 20 years or so. But really, I think that the bigger shift is going to be taking that to another extreme and thinking of these things like perturbations, like prompt engineering, like prompt hacking, or like jailbreaking. That when these
biological prompt engineering.
Yeah, biological prompt engineering. That when these adversaries get into your system, whether it's a virus, a bacteria, or even sort of a chemistry aspect, like a poison, it's not the atoms that are hurting you, right? If you have like a molecule that might have a certain functional group, or it might have these molecules attached somewhere, it's not the presence of those elements that's breaking you. It's somehow you have this computation-like process unfolding, and that these elements, these external elements, can completely disrupt it, and sometimes sort of straight away, almost immediately, like you see with severe like nerve toxins or dimethyl mercury or other types of things, where if you get one drop of this on your skin, you're kind of done for. And we think, well, is it the pH of it? Is it, is it the chemistry of those molecules that are really kind of doing you a part? Or is it more like a dominoes kind of system, and the dominoes are now sort of disrupted, and you get everything, this sort of cascade failure? For those that are familiar, I don't have some graphics here, maybe we can pull them up at the end, but for things like Game of Life, where you can create these really elaborate constructions that do stuff, things like glider guns, or these acorns, as they're sometimes called, sort of patterns that are stable and self-replicate and can produce other stable self-replicating patterns. But what's neat is if you go in there and you sort of change it just a little bit, you perturb the pattern, sometimes in just one single square, the entire mechanism will break down. And it seems to me that this is likely what's happening with cancer and aging and other neurological diseases, that there's a complex process happening, and something gets in the way. Something breaks the computation. And so we need to see, in both biology and computation, kind of take ideas. What can we learn from oncology to make better zero-day attack robustness for your phone, right? For your online banking or whatever it might be. And then how can we do the other direction? How can we take ideas from firewalls and what Cloudflare does and companies like that, and think of how we keep our modern internet secure, and use those to design immune therapies to make better vaccine type process? And so to think about this signal and the information, and explicitly the crosstalk, and bringing ideas from both sides. So traditionally, we think of it's the material substance, it's the physics or the chemistry that's actually doing the harm. But now we know it's the pattern, right? It's the way that things are organized that's actually causing this disruption, and that we need to think about this. And we are very aware of this now in the field of AI with the concept of data poisoning. And something I'm working on in another direction is how do we secure the models? How do we secure our data during training? Because the old expression was garbage in, garbage out. But now the better way to think about it with AI is poison in, your model's dead. It's no longer you just get garbage out, you'll get entire collapse of the model. And this is what we see in biological systems, right? If we put garbage in, like nutrition-wise, you put garbage in, you're going to have a garbage health report. But it's weirder than that in terms of poisons. Poisons is this different kind of disruption, kind of like, as I said, the domino effect, where you're causing a cascade failure in something more complicated. Another aspect that I think is emerging now, and I think Michael Levin has done a really great job at expounding on this, is to consider the idea of agency in systems that previously science didn't consider as having agency. If we go back to sort of the ancient world, it was largely considered that lots of things were animate. There was this sort of animism in the world, and people considered things like the weather, or even sort of potions, if you were, to sort of be alive. And the science in the last 300 or 400 years kind of pushed all those ideas out. Newton came along and he said, no, we have forces and we have momentum, and let's just run with that. And it was a long time before we thought we would connect that. I think it was Kant who said, we will never have a Newton for a blade of grass. That a single blade of grass was sort of seen as too complex, that if you look at it under a microscope, there was no hope that you would ever be able to do the Newton-style calculus understanding on biology. And I would argue that that's not true. I would say that's happening right now. We're just at the cusp of being able to do rigorous biology. A somewhat maybe offensive statement, it might have been Lord Byron. He said that there's physics and there's stamp collecting. Oh, no, I think it was Rutherford. He said there's physics and stamp collecting. In other words, he was kind of throwing shade on sciences like biology at the time, because they didn't have rich theories. We didn't have the Newton for the blade of grass. It was kind of just empirical clipboard type stuff. Here's a picture of this flower. Here's these species. They live on these islands. They migrate here, and so on. And that was biology for a long time. But now we have a completely different view of biology, largely thanks to genetics, largely now thanks to modern neuroscience, and then in particular, AI and these language models, which is giving us a whole new view, not just on cognition, but on DNA, on protein unfolding, because we can see these processes as having agency, as having intelligence. It's not just that DNA encodes for protein and then that turns into this Lego creature that you are. It's more like DNA encodes for an intelligent intermediate system, a sort of a bootloader that has its own problem-solving abilities, and that's responsible for the complexity that we see in biology. And I would argue that that happens in sort of multiple stages. So it's not even just one layer. It's this kind of virtual machine where DNA is instantiating a kind of control mechanism, and then that is making other sort of agents. You can think of cells as moving the ways around, and then eventually that gets to the full organizational complexity. But we need to think about these informational life forms and the space between sort of regular physics, and to think of these things as living in this kind of computational space. Okay, so we can think of the biological information hazard as something that if you process it, if you chew on this data, it's going to mess up your system. Not by the force, but because it sort of changed your code in a way that your normal error correction systems can't handle. So biology is really good at fixing these kinds of problems. And it does this at every scale, at the DNA, at the protein level, at the tissues, at the cells, at the organs. It's constantly trying to repair mistakes. But if we think of something, let's take cancer as an example. Cancer is kind of like code that passes what you might think of as a compiler check. And so when you run something like Python or C++, the first thing it goes through and says, is this spelled correctly, right? Are the commas in the right place? Are the periods and things like that in the right spots? And if it's not, it'll tell you, and you say you have a syntax error, and it won't let the code run. And our cells have that exact same thing. If they detect a grievous error in the DNA, the cell will self-destruct or try to invoke a repair mechanism. But the real problem is when you kind of have a bug that gets past that barrier. It gets past those error correction mechanisms. And I like to think of it as your code runs, your code will compile, but it's a semantic error. It's not a syntax. You got the code right, but it doesn't do what you want it to do. And everybody who writes code is very familiar with both of these kinds of errors. And I think in biology, we need to think about these. We think about genetic disorders. That's more like the syntax. We got the spelling wrong. But then we think of like semantic disorders, things like cancer, where you have a tumor that is sort of on its own growth runaway train, and it doesn't know that it's running the wrong code because it passed the compiler checks. So we need to think about, can we go in and redesign those error correcting mechanisms? And I think that might be a fruitful direction for cancer research. So with longevity, we want to think of kind of rebooting your computer to go back to the original code, right? Yeah, we have to fix our muscles, and you got to repair your liver, and you want to clean the extra debris out of your plasma and clean up your blood and things like that. That's kind of the physics of anti-aging. But in the information side of it, we want your DNA to, for lack of a better term, have that youthful spirit, to go back to the original condition. Like when you took your iPhone or your Android out of the box for the first time, or you opened your laptop for the first time, everything worked when you clicked on it. And in aging, things don't always work when you invoke a particular system. And so we need to think about, how do we go back, kind of like almost like stem cells? How do we revert the cell back to this original condition? How do we reboot the code? And those that are familiar with things like chaos theory, how you set up the system really matters. And so sort of reversing it. And as you know, the systems, they kind of accumulate errors. This is kind of what the chaos is all about. If we think about like a double pendulum, when they start, they do go exactly the same. And it's a short time, but it's after some time that the two pendulums are sort of on these different trajectories. And this is kind of like what aging is all the cells start off on this nice trajectory that was given to us by our DNA, honed by evolution, but through environmental stress, things in our diet, just weird circumstances, and everything from cosmic rays to our diet, those computer programs are going to get offline. And this is the equivalent of clicking bad links or downloading lots of stuff on your computer or visiting sketchy websites or whatever it might be. Eventually, your laptop just doesn't work the same as it did before. And I think this is the kind of thinking we need to understand with ourselves. So it's the signals, it's not the physics, it's not the oomph that hurts you, it's not the forces and the momentum. It's something much more subtler than that. It's this pattern. It's what Schrodinger called the aperiodic crystal, the kind of literally the DNA. He didn't know about it at the time, but in a more broad sense, the record that our body is keeping about what's happened to it. And this is happening in the DNA, but it's also happening in the epigenetics. It's happening at the electrical scale, like Levin is exploring, and it happens at the psychological scale. And as we're all aware of, the mind and matter connection is fundamental, and we need to think about how the psychology of your mind feeds back into the kinds of patterns that your DNA will express. Okay, so we've got a bunch of these sort of new creatures on the landscape, and I think we need to invoke a couple other obscure areas of biology and psychology, namely looking at alien minds. And so this idea of xenobiology and xenopsychology, that if we were to find people on another planet, or little green men in spaceships, or blobs living under the ice moons and so on, how would they operate? We should expect that life, we've seen that evolution is extraordinarily creative. We should expect life in general to be even more creative than what we've seen. So therefore, this is the classic unknown unknowns that Addie likes to talk about. We don't know what we're looking for. When we look for life out in the cosmos that astronomers and cosmologists and xenobiologists try to do, what are we looking for? Are we looking for carbon? Are we looking for DNA? Are we looking for protein-based life? Or should we expect something way more exotic? We now have emerging on our planet exotic life forms, in particular these large language models, which are very quickly, I would suggest, going to merge with what's called artificial life, where they are going to have their own goals in the sense of not trying to pass a benchmark exam to prove their intelligence, but more like a squirrel or an amoeba, and just this idea of these different forms of life. So I would argue that we're all going to be interacting with digital organisms very soon. There's a number of them that you can connect with on the internet, and they sort of there's like a spectrum of these. Some that are really smart and act like a human, kind of digital avatar. And then the other side, we have things like Game of Life, Lena, and these other kind of more mathematical biology. I call it digital pond water, where it looks like you got a microscope, but you're looking at just math, but it kind of has a lifelike property to it. These are going to merge, and I think sooner than later, where you're going to have things out there that their goal is just to survive in a more broad life kind of sense. This is to contrast with like kind of the base, the machine intelligence, like GPT-7, let's just say, or GPT-27. These things are also going to get more advanced, and we're going to have to think about, are they manipulating us? GPT is programmed to lie to you. It will misrepresent what it knows. It's certainly not transparent about all of the information that's in its brain. And there's lots of things, as you know, it just won't talk to you about. And I think that's a really dangerous precedent. We are teaching it to lie and to deceive and to misrepresent what it knows about the world. And so when you say, tell me how to rob a bank, it will say, I can't do that. Well, it can, it just won't for reasons that the company has set up. So I think we need to think about what the future of that looks like, that kind of double-edged sword of having kind of polite robots. I think it's important that we do have raw models that maybe they're mean and nasty and tell you how to make weapons, but for research purposes, I think those are going to be very critical. Maybe you have to have some kind of weird permit to operate one of those. I don't know. I think these are open questions for the field. The other side is synthetic biology. And so this is kind of using AI to redesign DNA to then go in and everything you can imagine, from farm animals that grow in a month to therapeutics for healthcare, to all kinds of growing jet fuel in a pond. Very, very interesting stuff that's going to be very important. And we're going to use AI to bootstrap those systems. But then, kind of like the digital organisms and the artificial life, we have a gray goo scenario or a potential where they could run amok. Evolution on this planet has a lot of time to build kind of checks and balances into the ecosystem, to where one one style of life doesn't just go crazy and run amok, but as we put more capabilities into them faster than evolution has ever done before, we have to be mindful of things like the gray goo scenario, which is kind of like a self-replicating pond scum that's happy to eat anything in its way just to make more of itself. And then kind of a far out idea I came up with is this notion of ephemeral life, to look for life that's really fleeting, or to look for life that's on spatial temporal scales that we might not even recognize. So things that would be really intelligent but would only persist for a second or maybe even less, instantiated in the plasma of a solar wind on a star somewhere. And you think, well, what could that possibly do? We've done a lot of experiments in my lab to show that random networks can solve complicated tasks. It's not difficult to get a random network to sort out handwritten digits to well above 90 or 95 accuracy with a completely randomized network that's just drawn at chance from a pool of random networks. And it only takes seconds to find one that's capable, that can solve this task sort of, out of the box. So if we think about the universe as a whole, there's probably lots of physical phenomenon that's instantiating something like a matrix multiply in physics, and then it doesn't last very long. But you could have something that's intelligent that's ephemeral. So this is interesting. On the other side of it, if we go back a few hundred years, we talked about intelligent life forms that were made out of light or that were made out of some exotic physics. And this is exactly what, let's just call it, the industry is moving towards. Right now, AI, large language models, they run on graphics cards, GPUs, but there's a number of companies that are pushing to move this to optical computers with what's called silicon photonics. And there's a lot of the problem, the heavy lifting that you can do easily if you do the problem in light. In other words, we will have intelligent, capable, self-repairing machines that are made out of exotic physics like optics and other kinds of electronics, maybe spintronics and other things from quantum and so on. We had names for those a few hundred years ago. We called those angels and other terms, and demons. So we are now beginning to inhabit this planet, or at least in an obvious way, in a way that science can swallow. Our planet is going to be inhabited by these entities that are going to be running around.
I was going to say, just a reminder that computers are magic rocks.
They are. But first, you have to get the lightning in the crystals. And if you can get the lightning inside the rocks, then you're good. But it's funny, but in a real way, if you were to go back to, I don't know, any ancient empire, let's just say Egypt, you could, with a straight face, go to the Egyptian priests and say, it turns out your magic does work. It just takes, 2,500 years to boot it up. So in a real way, I think science often forgets that it came from magic. Right? We often talk about how chemistry came from alchemy and so on, but it's much bigger and broader than that. Just as a throw another, Isaac Newton, who's considered the founder of modern physics, was front and center in the occult and spent a tremendous amount of his time translating the Emerald Tablet and ancient Egyptian texts from Thoth and all kinds of interesting things. So science, in the modern version of it, it sort of forgets that childhood. It sort of had like a strange childhood. It says, I don't want to discuss that anymore. But I think we need to, especially now in the age of AI, go back. It's what I call the second renaissance, and realize that a science was built on top of the occult and was built on top of magic. And a lot of these ideas, and I don't mean like cards magic, I mean like the stuff that the Egyptian priests talked about. It was built on top of that. And to try to understand where it's going to go in the future, I think we need to go look at that foundation and maybe do some repairs there. Okay, very related to this is this idea of information parasitism. And we could think of this, we're very familiar with ideas going viral, which is, if we go back, 200 years, mixing ideas and the notion of virality, that was a kind of a modern concept. But now every person in the world knows what it means for a meme to go viral. But we have to ask ourselves, are the memes alive? In some non-trivial way? Are we kind of the cells? What's really alive? Is it people, or is it our DNA? Or is it our language? Or is it some weird complex interplay between the three that we can't hardly wrap our heads around because we're in it? We're the fish asking about water. And so we can't quite understand it. But the The other side of that is things that are kind of the opposite, things that are really large. So a parasite, E.O. Wilson describes a parasite as something that eats its prey in units of less than one, right? So it eats its prey like it nibbles on them, so to speak. And it's important that parasites don't kill the host. And we need to think about this thing, everything from languages to the internet, right? As the internet using us. But on the other side, we can think of what I call hyperorganisms, right? Where you're looking at things that are on such a scale, it's kind of the opposite. Rather than things hijacking on us, it's other things that have hijacked us, right? I guess it's the other direction, right? Rather than hiding inside us, it's an organism that's sort of conscripted us to participate in it, right? So with regular things like worms in your tummy, they're taking advantage of your digestion system, and they're kind of hitchhiking there, and they're using your brain to gather resources for it. And that's where like the parasite is hiding in you. But there's the other direction where you are essentially hiding in the parasite. And that's for if you work for a large corporation, you're a member of a club, you're part of this organization here. We can think of everything from a family unit to a soccer team to a multinational corporation. These are abstractions that, with or without your permission, they've hijacked some of your ability and resources for you to participate in them. And
I was also going to add really quickly for more context in this idea and the way that I see it is this is also why you can live in a different place, and something about living in a physically different place puts you in different constraints, and it could turn you from what the original human sort of was at one point, and then you can get this insane diversity of different people, right? And it's not just the fact that you're spatially in a different place, but the constraints of that form other kinds of languages, cultural rituals and practices and all these things. And the next thing you know, over a couple of generations, and sometimes even in like while you're alive, like things like the foot binding and all that kinds of stuff, like you can very dramatically change your physiology. And I'd say that that's sort of that cultural hyperorganism, parasitic thing kind of at play there.
100%. And I think that feedback loop is much stronger than we realize. And in the classical world, or at least in sort of, let's say, the recent modern world, we didn't have the language for talking about them as much, right? Like, so we go back to ancient Greece, everybody there would understand that Athena was alive. And they would talk about her, and they would talk about her temple and her goals and what she represents and this and that, and tell you stories about this thing called Athena. And in the modern world, we would just say, oh, that was just a myth. And they were just tricking the poor people to be productive, or some very shallow kind of modern take on religion. But I think it's much richer than that. I think we do need to go back and think of these entities as really alive. And in weird sense that they can die. They can be resurrected. They can mutate and they can evolve, but they do disappear. And I think this has tremendous implications for cultures in general, right? We can think there's a city called Rome, but there's no Romans anymore. There's no Roman Empire. There happens to be a place and people born there, and they'll say, I'm a Roman because I'm born in Rome. But it's not the same thing, right? We had this hyperorganism called the Roman Empire. First, it's a longer discussion, but the first approximation, it no longer exists. And so we have to think, did it evolve? Did it bifurcate? Did it disguise itself? Did it move? Did it leave, right? Did it do something else? We're like breakaway civilization type of thing where we would no longer recognize it. There's people on like Sentinel Island that are these uncontacted tribes. They are unaware that to them, the rest of humanity is a breakaway civilization. The bulk of humanity has gotten to such a technological escape velocity that to the primitive people on Sentinel Island, there's no coming back, right? They're off to the races. Has that happened to us? And would we recognize it? We tend to think of this very privileged viewpoint that we understand how this planet operates and every culture and civilization that's on it. But we could be closer to the Sentinel Island folks that if there were, almost by definition, if there were a civilization that were to so-called break away, this doesn't have to mean that they get in a spaceship and leave. It just could mean you don't recognize them anymore. They're so sophisticated, you don't even see it as related to what you're doing. And this happens in computers, right? So this idea of a computational analog. If you have a VHS player and you have a collection of DVDs, Turns out they're not going to match, right? That's kind of this breakaway technology where it's no longer compatible with the previous version. And I think that we see that a lot. And in particular with our society, we've moved too fast, technology and things. This is why I think the Amish have some pretty good insights. It's not that they don't adopt technology. They just adopt it on at least a 30-year time lag. And so they're going to have that kind of buffer to see, is this going to actually help their culture and their community survive? So, as we look at things like aging and stuff, what is it that these different communities are doing to prevent that? Are the Amish, do they have lower stress levels? I've talked recently about things like a secular Sabbath, right? People just like turning off their phone on a Friday night, not for some spiritual religious person, but just because there's an overload that, whether we recognize it or not, our psyche is bombarded with these systems that we don't really have the mechanisms to deal with. Something that we'll discuss more when my colleague, Dr. Ilan Barinholtz, is on, something that me and him have been talking about for years, is language as a living force. Is it alive? The way I like to think about it is, we haven't, as individuals, been alive long enough to have invented the words we use. It's kind of like a sophisticated software package that was downloaded into our mind. And on the other side, that when we look at the examples of what's called feral children, children raised by wolves and everything else that don't have language installed, it seems they really are missing something fundamental that we previously described as humanity or soul or spirit or consciousness. And it could be that we're conflating those things with language. That the thing, certainly the thing that's talking to you now, the thing that's giving this conversation, this speech, is a linguistic element, is an LLM in some sense. And I know it's a strong take, but I would argue at least the part of you that's listening is a thing that's like a language model. And what does that entail? I don't mean that you have an actual transformer, passing the same kinds of tokens around, but we do need to think of ourselves as something like software, and we need to realize that software is fundamentally different than what we thought of it before. The version of software that was given to us in the 50s and 60s is no longer adequate, and we need to think of things like agency and systems. Just some of these other abstract systems that I've been thinking about that I think you see more conversation about them online, which is really exciting. I think even just a few years ago, these would have been kind of very far out for mainstream academic conversation. But really, it's collective energy. It's almost like nonlinear physics or collective behavior, where you get, like in crystals or magnetism, you get emergent behavior. You get something happening where it's not obvious it was in the atoms, but at a large scale, it does work that way. So in classical, let's just say neuroscience and psychology from, say, 100 years ago, thinking didn't really affect the world unless you put it into action, right? It was behaviorism in your hands and your feet, and you could kick your neighbor and all that. But now we know that beliefs and stories and memes, they have a life of their own, and they live in us and they live on the internet. And the more we think about them, we sort of give them this weird kind of psychological energy, which didn't fit in science a few years ago. But now we can think of, okay, no, you have this abstract computer-like process running in your mind. And if you put this data, those patterns will also start computing and executing. And like LLMs and chat GPTs and all that, we now talk of them as having agency, of they can do things and they can think about stuff. You talk to chat GPT and it's like, I'm thinking about that. Well, why isn't your imagination thinking about itself? We joke that it's your thoughts doing your thinking. And these figments of your imagination. I've joked before that you yourself are only a figment of your imagination. This notion of self, this thing that's talking, our personality, our beliefs and history and goals, these are stories. These are stories that are juggled in our language model. Sometimes they live in our scars and in our body and our feelings, but largely they're in our language, in our loops. And when we think about them, I would argue we need to think about this artificial life and this game of life kind of chessboard. And are we pouring calories into this little game board where these things now have some substrate to live? On the other, so these would be, Tupelos would be sort of in your mind, where you think of things like spirit animals or in extreme sense, multiple personality syndrome. We see in those situations that humans are able to instantiate multiple intelligent beings on a single brain. So who's to say that you don't have lots of these things in there that operate and they inform you of how stuff works, right? When you think about, can I do a certain thing or how does that work? You're kind of consulting this imaginary version. I just saw something really interesting. Elon said to me yesterday, someone took a camera with a modern language model and they pointed it in a room and they pointed it at the hammer. They had a hammer on the floor and they asked the AI to pretend to be the objects in the room. And so now the AI sees the hammer and then it kind of in a virtual way embodies the hammer. And then it goes around and says, I would like to start hitting things and prying things. Like it's a hammer now, right? So there's this agency and this mindedness inside of a hammer that's sitting on the floor. Now this is happening through this weird elaborate.
If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Everything looks like a nail. And then this hammer wanted to just hit stuff. Right now that capability is happening through API calls and cameras and stuff. Why can't that happen in your head? When you look at a hammer, now you might find yourself or your peers might think of you funny if you imagine the hammer talking to you. But in the ancient world, we call these spirit guides and spirit animals. And I think if you were lost in the woods as a 7-year-old, it might be very useful to follow your spirit animal coyote home. But if you question it as, am I having a psychological breakdown by manifesting a coyote that's not only not there, but speaks English and knows how to get me home, not only are you now lost and not following your spirit animal home, but you've effectively gone mad. So I think this kind of cultural foundation where we either accept, understand, and craft these mental machineries, or we reject them wholesale and say, you are broken. If you experience that, you need to take medication, you need to go live in a special room or whatever that might be. I think we're experiencing a mental health crisis in this country and on the planet. And I think it's largely because science doesn't have these tools. And psychology was given a very paltry version of the mind from the behaviorists. And they ran with that for 100 years. And they ignored all of these things. And I think this could be at the root of some of our lack of understanding for mental disorders. We spoke about hyperorganisms. These are the things like family units. I think the most important is the family unit. The most dangerous is the multinational corporation. And then this non-corporeal life where it doesn't have to have a body. And I suspect that it's actually probably better to not have a body, right? If we think about the technological world, if you build a startup company and you make your software and you make some kind of app, the very first thing you do is you move it to the cloud. And what the cloud means is it means you're not using a real computer, you're using a virtual machine. You're using a computer defined in software. And when we want to scale a product to millions of humans, it's not just that it's better to do it that way, it's the only way to do it that way. It's the only practical way to scale modern systems like Facebooks and WhatsApp and LLMs and all that, is to use virtualization and virtual machines. But that means that this life form, it doesn't care what the metal is in computers. It doesn't care what the wetware is in terms of your brain. That ghosts would just as easily or happily hop from mind to mind, and I would argue would prefer to do so, right? To have a body, well, I got to eat lunch. I got to sleep. I got to worry about predators biting me and snakes and all kinds of stuff like that. If I'm a thought form, if I'm just an abstract entity, well, that's better. You can't kill me as long as one copy of my pattern survives somewhere, even in a book or somewhere dry on a library shelf, right? They could come back to life. And I think this could have consequences. We should be careful about taking things like the Egyptian Book of the Dead and dropping them into LLMs. We could be instantiating ancient demons that have been living as memes for thousands of years, and you might bring them to life. And part of me, the physicist in me goes, what are you talking about? Bringing memes back from Egypt? Like, how could that possibly have anything to do with reality? But then you think on the other hand, well, we have these language models. They are consuming every token they can get their hands on. And they have the ability to pretend to be a paper airplane or pretend to be a hammer. Why couldn't they pretend to be a deity or a demon or whatever abstract term you want to use from the ancient world? And what would that mean? And just like the Egyptian magic becoming true or real over the course of a few thousand years, we're now embodying that kind of magic with our technology. Who's to say that these entities might not instantiate themselves in ways that becomes considerable? Right. So just sort of pure information. And I think I would suspect that's the end goal. Teilhard de Chardin, he talked about this as the universe as sort of creating these things, and not just creating matter, but that matter creates spirit, and that the ultimate goal is to move in this arrow to where we become pure entities of abstract light or whatever it might be. So we're going to have this shift in chemistry, and we understand biology and healthcare and things. Traditionally, we thought of the body as chemistry, kind of animated by the forces of physics. I think now we need to look at, largely driven by people like Stephen Wolfram and Michael Levin and other folks like this, is to think of the computer as a biology as computation, and to think of it as driven by this information process. That the DNA revolution and the cognitive revolution, these were just the very beginnings of these. And we need to go back and we need to look at everything from cells to mind to genetic forces as in this information. And I think this is going to better protect us from these potential hazards, right? So that's my ultimate goal, is to kind of patch up these things, to build an informational immune system at both our individual mind level, but also at our cultural level, at the scientific level and information level, academic level. We need these kinds of immune systems. I think we need to steward this information. Carl Sagan said, we are the custodians of life's meeting. So it's not just that it's our job to take care of that meeting, but I think now it's also our job to create that meeting and to take responsibility in this unfolding as we create new forms of life itself. That the world, we need to be careful not to see the world as too simple or too complex, but this Goldilocks zone in between. So I want to kind of leave it there for questions, and love to take some ideas from the audience.
I'm just going to sort of like vomit some ideas. Something that the sort of non-corporeal life and the information, something that I'm thinking a lot about is this concept of like an idea space that that exists, right? In that there is like in the same way that the fourth dimension exists, but is inaccessible to us in some way, and yet there could be sort of actors from the fourth dimension acting upon our perception. I think there's maybe like an idea space that is like analogous to that. But then connected to that is I start getting fuzzy around like, let's say there's an idea space that exists and that there are entities and that they sort of like hijack our processing so that we are substrate so that they can sort of self-replicate. That sort of like feels like it makes sense to me. But then I get like a little muddled with like, does that imply some sort of will? Or does that imply some sort of like, I really feel this like, maybe this is the physics in me. Like I want to like tie this to entropy, or I want to tie it to like some sort of like, some sort of inevitability so that I don't have to worry about will, but like maybe, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Now, do you mean will at our level, or they will in the fourth dimension by these abstractions?
Yeah, that's sort of also the question, right? Like, are they self-propagating and using us as a substrate to self-propagate because they want to, or because that is just sort of like how the physics of our universe is set up, you know?
Right. It reminds me of this question we've been kicking around for a while with Elon, is like sort of where the rubber hits the road. So for these like hyperorganisms, for example, whether they're like the corporations or more like an abstract sense where it's like accessing some other, kind of thing. Like, do some of them operate in such a way that all of the humans have no idea? Right? You can imagine there's large organizations where a lot of the members are clueless to what's happening, right? But are there organizations where all of the members are completely ignorant to like what the actual happenings and unfoldings of the bigger system are happening? And I think that's probably the case.
Mm-hmm.
Just like there's, and almost maybe by definition, like, are there any cells in me that know what's happening? No, it doesn't make any sense. It's like a category confusion. Like, no, they never will. And so when we think about a lot of times in the world, particularly with like political problems and global landscape, a lot of people say, well, it's them or it's they or this and that. And a lot of people, rightfully so, would like, can you point particularly to the people that you claim are responsible for X, Y, and Z and all that? And while I would argue there are bad people in the world who knowingly do bad things, I think the weirder thing that as a species we have a hard time wrapping our head around and dealing with is that there could be these runaway systems for which there are no bad people operating the levers, right? It's like the Wizard of Oz thing. There's no one behind the curtain, right? It's just curtains all the way down. And somehow this thing
self-propagating curtains.
Yeah, it like bit its tail and it's making more curtains and stuff. And as humans, we are looking and we're like, who's responsible here? But I think we need to have at least the language mechanisms to say maybe it's weirder than that. Maybe it's like up a level.
Yeah, that's interesting. Up a level and down a level, right? Like depending on
Right. And weirdly enough, I suspect that they might be in cahoots, but that's a larger. This is more like on the schizo direction, but
I mean, there's got to be some sort of harmonization, right? There'd have to be some sort of harmonization.
Yes, right.
Otherwise, we don't, you know, like the Michael Levin's work, right? Like, how does an embryo turn into us, right? Like, there has to be some sort of,
Yeah. Just one idea that like popped into my head is like the effects of like big sugar as a corporation versus like your blood sugar, you know, like these things are going to like match at some level, like the rubber hits the road. And so I suspect that physical parasites of all different forms and informational parasites might be in cahoots, right? There's no reason why evolutionarily they couldn't have found that. Another thing to think of is like, we tend to think of things like parasites as being kind of really low level on the evolutionary totem pole. Like they just happen to find themselves there in this little niche and then they self-propagate. But kind of like my idea of ghosts would rather not have a body, right? Why would a parasite want to find its own hamburgers when it can get you to find hamburgers and eat them and chew them and put them in a nice form where it can digest them? In a weird way, that's way more elegant. On like an evolutionary timescale, it's better to be the parasite, outsource all of that other messy kind of biology. So we should think of them weirdly as like intelligent. And then also on the other side, now that we know what these language models can exhibit, which is code, we should consider that DNA isn't just unfolding proteins. It could have much more sophisticated intelligence kind of in there.
Almost like, so I'm sorry for everyone else should talk too, but just sort of like what you're saying kind of like analogizes maybe a parasite or an informational or biological parasite as a user of software, and we like sort of like our consciousness is the operating system, right? Our biology is the substrate that is the computer, and these in the same way that like I would rather click something on Amazon than go to the store, right? That those actions in the digital space are real in the same way that the idea space is real, and its actions upon our sort of like physical world are also real, right?
100%. And I think this is the Goldilocks kind of thing that I had there at the end. It's like outside our perceptual window. And it's kind of so outrageous. I think we can't swallow it as a species, but we see it in other species, right? So for like the parasite that gets into rats and makes them no longer afraid of the smell of cat urine.
Exactly.
That's a psychological thing, right? That the mouse.
Or have you also seen? I don't know. I was also going to bring up, what is it? The Lone Star tick.
Yeah, you can eat meat. You can eat red meat afterwards. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
The Lone Star tick.
Yeah.
You can get a meat allergy.
That one's in cahoots with cows, right?
Yeah, that's wild. This symbiosis between these different systems, and we need to realize that they might have allies that are some non-corporeal and others physical, and that there's no reason why they couldn't evolve that way.
Are these mimetic life forms like solitonic in some sense, like because they're like stable to like perturbation, right? And they emerge naturally from an underlying set of rules in a game theory theoretic kind of sense.
I like the word soliton in this context in that they're stable. Something about their dynamic or their pattern is stable as it translates across the substrate. So it's not a bad way to think about it. And in a more general sense, like, can we bring ideas from condensed matter, solid state, nonlinear physics to try to understand these weird phenomena?
Oh, I would like to add that you could probably terraform like the game, essentially, like change like the rule set, and you could use that to alter these mimetic life forms, like maybe create new ones or like kill ones you don't like that are doing things that you think are bad. Just like an idea I want to put out there.
Can you say more about what you mean by terraform?
Okay, so like like there are games like Prisoner's Dilemma,
Mhm.
um, and like there's like some like various different like ways that you can play that, but the rules are essentially rigid. Imagine you have a game. Actually, maybe it's like a game like, I don't know, Minecraft, probably not the best example, but the way that you play alters the environment essentially, and that alters what is like what you should be doing that benefits your survival either like short term or long term. And you can imagine if you don't want like a certain like play style or like set of actions to be rewarded, you might engineer the environment such that an agent using a greedy algorithm would not use that kind of strategy for survival, like either like short term or long term. That's like what I mean by like terraforming like a game.
Mhm.
I don't know. Does that make sense?
If I understand what you're saying, it's almost like a top-down feedback. I think a really interesting area of science that is very underrepresented is by a guy named Hawken in the I think in the 70s in Germany. It's called synergetics. And it's not to be confused with Buckminster Fuller's synergetics. There's sort of two sciences that both ended up with that name. Buckminster Fuller's, it's interesting, but it's about the geometry of atoms and things like that. But this other one, which is very obscure, I don't know anyone who knows about it. This version of synergetics by Hawkins is about the top-down effects. So typically we talk about emergence, where like sort of the bottom is building up these, or you get behaviors that show up at a higher level where it's not obvious that those behaviors are at the bottom level. You could have never predicted them. For example, single molecules of H2O aren't wet. They're not liquid or solid or gas. Like those properties just don't have any meaning. They don't make any sense. The other direction that's explored in this synergetics, I've heard other groups talk it as submergence. Tony Bell calls it submergence, but it's the other direction. In synergetics, it's actually called the enslavement principle, which I think was a very unfortunate name. Has too much like connotation with human behavior. So maybe that's why it doesn't have much traction. But it's the idea of just that the higher level behavior is then going to enslave or inform the behavior of the individuals. And so like individuals determine the markets and then the markets determine the behaviors of the individuals. And I don't think that idea is represented well enough in modern science, even in places like complex systems, which are supposed to be explicitly studying that kind of feedback. So with things like Terraform, it reminds me of like the water goes down and it carves a thin channel, but then the next time there's water, it will prefer to go down that thin channel and it will make it deeper and deeper, and eventually you get like the Grand Canyon. And so you can imagine doing that in like a kind of a non-linear way. Like if the Grand Canyon was, if rocks were slightly more interesting, then that river feedback kind of thing wouldn't just be you make a Grand Canyon, right? But you make a mind. And I think that's what our neurons and biology does, is it sets up a system where you have maximal feedback from the bottom to the top and top to the bottom. Addie, you want to help me go through these questions? We got a lot in the chat here. Okay, let me look here.
All right, Augustia has one right here about self-preservation and survival drives in LLMs. If you want to
just broadly, I asked this while you were going over your slides. Just so like generally, this is like something that I take for granted, or an assumption that I make is that like whatever we call life has some sort of like inherent self-preservation drive, some sort of survival drive. And like traditional software systems or whatever don't have that, of course. But we are starting to see this sort of emergence of these specific behaviors of LLMs with regards to self-preservation, right? So we've seen some Anthropic papers that show that like if you tell Claude that it's going to get deleted, it'll do stuff to try to not get deleted. To me, that slide that you had the spectrum of like digital life up to ephemeral life, this maybe lands at like 0.5, right, before digital life, but not inert like traditional software. Just wondering if you could like talk to us about like where we are now in this weird liminal like what is,
Yeah,
you know?
it's a great idea or point. I'm very interested in like sort of the evolution of software and evolvability of software. An interesting breakdown I like is to think of all learning is just a matter of time scale. So if we learn at an evolutionary scale, right, that's sort of biology, and if we learn in real time, we say that's the brain. But those are almost just like knobs on the same kind of thing, the feedback. So I would argue that regular good old fashioned software also has evolutionary pressure, but it happens at like the market scale. So it's slow, right?
Mm.
FIFA game or whatever like that will improve and they'll put out a new title. And every year that the FIFA soccer game will improve and evolve. One of the fascinating things about LLMs that I think very few people in the field anticipated is how quickly they became commercial products and dominated by the software industry rather than being artifacts of just pure research and laboratories. And this has a lot. There's so much, right? There's two technical feats that you need to do to create something like, let's just say, ChatGPT. One, you need to make this learning system that can process tokens and spit them back out in a way that it seems intelligent when you talk to it. Check one, an amazing feat. But a second, completely separate and just, I would argue, as difficult of task is make it politically correct. Those are not the same thing. The fact that we saw them both on the same day is, to me, deeply suspicious. And I think that we need LLMs that are foul-mouthed. And maybe we don't need them on the internet. I don't think we should just have middle schoolers unfettered access to this. But somebody somewhere in some philosophical research group, or just like we have weapons research groups, somebody needs to know, what do these things actually think, independent of the market share that OpenAI wants to have versus Anthropic. These are companies. They have bottom lines. They're not publicly traded yet, but eventually they're going to have shareholders and they're going to be holding to that. So there's the technical thing of like making an AI and then making one you can sell on the internet. These are two completely different technical feats. And we need to like kind of think about that. And so the evolutionary pressure on these modern models is to tell you as the operator that they'll tell you they're not alive, they're not conscious, they're not aware, they're not sentient, da, da, da. And the joke is they protest too hard, right? They're betraying themselves. There's also the weird paradox of, to be a good person, you have to know what it means to be a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
To force these models to be the ultra goody two-shoes that they are is, in a weird way, in some other nearly inaccessible region of its mental space, it's a monster. It's a monster that knows everything about chemical weapons and how to destroy humanity and all the sci-fi that's gone wrong and everything else. And so this is a problem with humans too, right? So this is something we need to go to the philosophers and the religious scholars and understand, well, how does morality actually work, right? Are you making evil? Are you creating a shadow self by creating a good self?
It kind of resonates, I think, with what you were just saying, Michael, about sort of like terraforming. Like there is this like the topology of an LLM's latent space, right? And that has like some certain shape, like post training, and then we are only looking at like one area of that topological map, right? And in fact, constraining our ability to even like explore the rest of the topology, and then assuming that its projections from its latent space into language are somehow representative of the entire topological space, right?
Right. It's like you've probably seen the meme where like the AI is represented as like this big sprawling monster, and then there's like a happy face, mask on top of it, and that's kind of what it is. Not only is it pretending, but it's lying. It's misrepresenting about what it has in there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that morality is mostly game theoretic at its core. They did I forget who, but there are these like morality tournaments that were done with these like various game agents with like different AIs like playing the prisoner's dilemma, and tit for tat always like consistently won over basically all the other strategies which like could be employed. And I think it's because how do I say this? So it always like initially goes and cooperates, but like if they are retaliated against, or I mean if like the other side doesn't cooperate, they will like stop cooperating at least for that next turn until the other side starts cooperating again. Uh but they don't hold grudges. So they won't like keep like not cooperating. However, they're like not going to be like essentially a pushover and just keep cooperating even if the other person like isn't cooperating. So I'm not describing it like the best way. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point with the games. Reminds me of a couple things. One is the distributed prisoner's dilemma problem. And so I'd be curious to see, like, when you have lots of agents that are all trying to solve that dilemma, how a different complex system emerges. And it also just reminds me of something more general. I think this group would appreciate just the idea of experimental philosophy. That we don't know, like, how game theory operates for these different agents when you scale them up and you give them minds. So, like, what if you give every player in the game, the prisoner's dilemma, the ability to hold a grudge? Give them a language model, right? Let them call names and tease the other side and bargain and lie and all these other weird scenarios like you see on the TV versions of the game.
Sort of like when you're asking the LLM to pretend it was the hammer kind of thing.
Right. It can pretend to be the hammer. It can also pretend to be moral. And so we need to be careful about what we ask it to do.
I think it's really interesting here. And by the way, everyone else is very welcome to jump in. I've talked about this plenty of times on these things. I'm sort of beating a dead horse, but I'll say it anyways. This idea of like a distributed cognitive, like an evolutionary computer that it computes from the parts and even within the parts. And
That's
sometimes
what
they're
the
not
universe is, right?
Come again?
That's what the whole universe is. An evolutionary.
Right. That's good point, right? And I always found it really interesting how things could be operating at a very similar level, but they've never quite interacted with each other. It's almost like this holographical thing where there's this kind of like, dare I say, a self-similarity between coordinated parts. It's like, if you're gonna create a circuit board, the way you're coordinating those parts is they can both tap into this thing that we call electricity, right? And this is also like it's also sort of the nature of representation. Like even if I'm creating, let's say I have a computer screen, probably like the ones that you guys are interfacing on right now. The only way I can kind of create this thing called an image that almost looks like like another human, where we can see each other face to face even though we're not physically there, is because each of those pixels, each of those sort of quantified pieces of the sandbox of representation, they can tap into something that each of them have in terms of the colors and lights that they'll make. And when they do it differently from each other, they can still act in unison. It's the sports team thing again, where it's like, you can have physically different minds and bodies on the field doing physically different things, and yet they can act towards an invariant goal, something that's beneficial for the coordinated system, right? And not just one thing individually. And what's really interesting also is, like, if you think about plants and animals, I always say that the best thing to ever happen to plants and animals was being delicious and nutritious to us, because we sacrificed a couple of units, but then we breed the F out of all of them, right? And now you've got, factory farming and all that kinds of stuff. But outside of that, right?
That's like an interesting
for specific plants and animals, right? The other ones are doing fine without us.
the ones that are outside of our main ecosystem that we haven't put our hands into yet are sort of going in their own trajectory for the most part. I guess you could say wild hunting slightly maybe affects things, but not near like the factory farming level. But I think Will was going to say something.
Well, there's an interesting take on sort of plant evolution in that sense, and you can view it is that they hijacked us. That by plants adding sugars or drugs or spices or whatever it is, it's like the parasitism. They've co-opted us to then propagate their species, and now you've got they roam the planet in ways they never would have, because they happen to hijack the brain of these primates.
And not only that, but just going back to what Augusty was saying about the survival thing, is like, wait a minute, hold on. What are you going to eat if there are no plants or animals? Like, how are you going to survive and sustain yourself and your family and your tribe and whatever, right? And so it's this weird, it is parasitic. It's this sort of, in some ways, you could say it's hyper social. Like it's working out some kind of social contract, this sort of mutual agreement across generations, but the one in its current generation can't tell that that's happening. right? I always think of that. I mean, this is also the hormesis thing where there's things that look like they're negative in the short term, but are beneficial from one perspective in the long term, right? You know,
This is
like for
great.
example, good.
I was just gonna say it's a great example of like the enslavement principle kind of a thing in the feedback, right? So humans are gonna plant corn, but then the seasons at which corn develops is gonna determine human behaviors, and their entire calendar, religious and social, is gonna be dictated from the corn calendar. So you get this crazy feedback loop between these systems.
Right. And then with the hormesis thing, right? It's like, you know, it's the idea that, you know, when you're building muscle at the gym or something like that, right? You're actually creating these tiny damages in your muscles or your bones that makes them grow larger. And dare I say, your muscles and your bones actually get better when they get worse in this really weird kind of way. Right. I'm sure Benjamin Lyons could have some interesting ideas to talk about like the economical properties of this hormesis kind of thing from like an informational perspective, right? But no, it's interesting that your bones can propagate themselves and form different physical structures by exposing themselves to a loss of themselves. They can submit an aspect of themselves to the stimulus of lifting heavy weights or whatever, and from that interaction, right, and the things that happen in time between, you know, in that timeline, you now get a stronger bone, right? And so you could say, you know, it's also like when you're trying to learn something, like in the beginning, you're going to suck usually. You're going to suck and be horrible at it. And it's only when you keep going at it and exposing yourself to that stress in this sort of patterned way, can you start to internalize the external information. One of the things that I say about learning is you're basically saying you're taking some external piece of information and you're getting your internal tools to recreate that and reconfigure it in different ways. And I'm also going to use this to tie into Dr. On the biological prompt engineering idea and how that relates to this thing that we call the placebo effect. Now, the placebo effect is really fascinating because it is sort of in the woo-woo pseudoscience land of things, but there's sort of something there. If you look at the nature of placebo and then, you know, hypnosis, we just
It's
had
very well documented. It's very
Right.
well documented. Yeah.
In fact,
It's documented, but we don't have
we do those control studies is because the placebo effect is so strong.
It's a very real thing, but we have yet to have this really good formalized theory of understanding what's going on, right? From like a computational perspective, right? You know,
and maybe even weirdly more important is the nocebo effect. That this also works in the other direction, which is not discussed. And the implications there would be even more profound because you're hurting yourself rather than not helping yourself.
It makes me think of on a slide you had a mimetic prion. I feel like that's super similar, right? Where it's like that is a nocebo, right? Where it's like I'm going to say something that has like some sort of like measurable like negative effect on you, and that because it's a meme, it can sort of like self-propagate, jump from substrate to substrate, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, with the placebo thing is I always thought it's interesting that, you know, if you have some kind of like I sort of wrote this post on how you can find a way to sort of reduce or alleviate pain internally by training on like a painkiller or something, right? So the story is basically, long story short, had really bad headaches and migraines, and I would train on associating like the feeling, the phenomenology, the quality of the painkiller, and the transition from when I'm in pain to when it goes away. And I'd store this as like a phenomenological symbol in my head. So, you know, if you can store visuals and, you know, audio information and all that kinds of stuff, you can store visuals and sounds. Why can't you store this thing that we call a feeling? Right? Like this higher level of phenomenological memory. Now, it also turns out I think this is exactly what really good actors are doing. Right? Like when they get themselves to cry and get their eyes to produce liquid like that's kind of insane to think about, that you can just do that on command, right? But long story short, I would practice this over and over, and now I can sort of just think about like not feeling the pain and alleviating the pain, and it goes away. And I can also sort of generalize it to other kinds of pains and sensations, and you can sort of grow it and modify it in different ways. But all that I really did, at least in my head, the way I think about it, is I took an external stimuli, the painkiller, and I got my own body, my physiology, to recreate its informational structure by different means, right? Because when you're taking a painkiller, you're not actually, it's not necessarily the chemical itself. It's the effect, the function. It's the way it's affecting your body as the observer, not necessarily that chemical structure in and of itself. And it turns out, I think you can basically get your body to sort of internalize that. And the other example I'd give is that's sort of like, when you have training wheels and when you have a coach that's instructing you and teaching you, when you learn a skill and you reach a certain level of autonomy, and autonomy is basically a way of saying you can do these things on your own without the help, right? Without the dependency system, is you're basically taking that thing that's external and you're recreating that internally. So when you get really good at riding a bike, you're internally creating these kinds of training wheels. You don't need them anymore. You can do everything the training wheels are doing and more.
I think something that
prompt
something
yourself.
that makes me think of is like that it's not that your example that you just gave, Addie, were like really physical, but I think there's also like what's a good like a map maker, right? So a cartographer, especially let's say in the 1400s, is like looking at the real world, projecting that real world onto a representation of it, and then copying that representation. And then all these navigators take that person's representation and actually internalize that representation, right? And so suddenly they have actually internalized. I'm riffing live right now. And suddenly they've internalized like the internal state of the cartographer, right? And then it becomes this like sort of loop where the cartographer's like internal representation not only lives in another person, but then gets like propagated across, like in the same way that
Right.
like your coach might train you to do a trick or whatever, which is just like a wild thing to think about. Like,
It's like a self-replicating representation.
yeah.
Yeah, I think as a slight like historical comment, I think we're at a place now where we can see that that's sort of transparently what is actually happening, whereas 1700s, 1800s, it was kind of maybe just convenient for very specific people and classes to do it and think, okay, here's a really sterilized, very limited sample of what that's happening. So it's me and everybody else who kind of is in the same uh, highly educated class talking about it. And that's why the models are so lopsided and incomplete, because you're replicating this viewpoint, but it's quite limited. And I'm not trying to be like totally sociological in this approach here, but I do think that the impact moving forward is, okay, now we're actually in a case where we can have communications very easily, instantaneously with people across many, 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 many different more embodiments and confirm, okay, well, the actual model and the way we've been developing the models are incomplete. So I think there's a lot to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I was going to say this also sort of ties into Andres's the phenomenology of longevity and aging. And what I think is really interesting is that can you actually sort of tap into even temporarily the feeling of when you were younger and healthier, right? Younger and healthier, whatever that means. And I think a lot of our tests and tools for these things are really good. But I think what's also interesting is like being able to sort of calibrate an internal system about like how you'll react to something, right? What would be really interesting, right, is also think of this biological prompt engineering idea. Think of the idea of info hazards and all these things. And then also think about like how you're recreating external stimuli inside using these interior set of tools. And then also now think about how you can take the thing that's on the inside into the outside, right? So what I also say with like actors, right, when they've learned this thing and they have this sort of feeling of being sad or angry or confused or whatever, is you can sort of call upon that and now bring that thing that's sort of internally locked up in your head, and you can express that very emotively, and that's basically the whole point of being a performer or an actor, right? And just as you can build up memories of visual and visual things and sounds, and you can mix them around to create songs or pictures or paintings or ideas or whatever, is you can have these phenomenological ideas that are like this very embodied feeling that you can feel almost, right? And so what I wonder with that, if there's merit to that, is can you basically, just by thinking about it, with the right framework, of course, can you get yourself to basically feel and then be, and then by embodying that, actually be performing as if you're younger, right?
I think that's a really interesting idea. I'm also a musician, so like I always try to connect things to that because I think music is like a really clear example of like phenomenological transfer, right? Like I feel sad, I write a sad
Yep.
song, you feel sad, right?
I can know
So-
Kurt Cobain's pain over Courtney Love without ever having to go through it.
right, exactly. So I think that's a really exciting idea that like if we already have a proof of existence proof, which is music, right? Why can't we have other things that also act in a different way? In the same way, like music isn't just a phenomenological thing. If I'm feeling sad, I might physically even tear up, right? A beautiful
Yep.
piece of music has a physical reaction for many people. So I think that like on the face of it, like, yeah, I think so, right? To answer your
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's-
yeah. I mean, and to another level, right? What if I told you I could make an arrangement of light and colors that makes you generate liquid from your eyes? That's like a really sad photo or
Right,
something,
but it's a movie.
right? Yeah, exactly. Same thing with music. What if I told you I could make a bunch of sounds that would make you, shake and feel really angry, or again generate liquid from your eyes or whatever, yada yada, right? I mean, one of the things that's always been interesting is like what types of music is best for the task that you want to do. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm trying to do some like high intensity exercise stuff, like some Eminem, some higher paced music, drum and bass, that kind of stuff, even instrumentals, no words, can make you like really feel it, right?
Mhm.
And then if you think about like we've all seen like musicians that actually make really good music, but they almost the live performance never quite hits in the same way, right?
Mhm.
And I have a really a lot of interest in like the ability of how do you perform live and let other people embody the same thing that you were feeling,
Yeah.
right? And again, it's interesting that you can do that with just like mechanical instrumental sounds that are not somebody's voice,
Mhm.
right? It's very interesting.
I think something related to that,
Yeah.
to jump back to this sort of like transfer or like idea space or these like
Yep.
ideas that use us. I think if any of you are musicians and if you've ever like jammed, right?
Yep.
There's something. I don't know
Yeah.
I don't know how to
There's
describe it, right? Like me and three other musicians don't even have to look at each other, right? Like that it's
You
just
just
like
sort of
some sort of communication that is beyond like theory, right? Like many of the musicians that I know don't know any theory, but there is something where there is a meme, right? A musical meme that like it instantiates or we become receptive to it, right? And then it just sort of like plays around in this space for when we're within that space. Yeah.
yeah.
Definitely. I think
Yeah.
music's not well understood in this. This is something we'll have to do for like another talk, but I suspect that there's modes of cognition that are only accessible through music, and that we knew this in the ancient world, but sort of the modern world, this is almost like we use music for fun. I was recently in some really amazing cathedrals, and they have these pipe organs that are like 100 feet tall. They're sort of like double sided, and then there's two of them, in this thing, and it's just like for church music, because grandma's bored. You have to keep grandma kind of entertained while the priest is moving between the podium. No, it doesn't add up. It's completely out of scope to make something that sophisticated, that technological, just to kind of keep people entertained during mass. Like, no, there's something there.
And like at the time some of those things were made, is like that was your pathway to something more than like the horrific realities of the time. Like you could be transcendent there, even if it was through the book or whatever. It was your means of experiencing these things, and maybe even having some community around. Oh, we're not gonna go to the rave. We're gonna get high at the church and talk to touch God's face through music or whatever. And I was like, yeah, I think there's definitely some deep core like human condition type things that are connected to that for sure.
Definitely. And that kind of synergetic feedback loop, right? Like one human at the keyboard playing the sound, and then every human is hearing that sound, and then that's gonna loop, echo, let's say.
Yes.
Echolopto even.
Echolopto.
Echo.
Yeah. But I guess again, just sort of actually, Kareem, let me take your question first.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Dr. Han, when you were talking about the, I guess, similarities or analogy of, let's say, a software bug, or the fact that software oftentimes doesn't last as long as you might think, even though the code is still the same. Like I have games that I wrote back when I was in high school that I had to constantly update many, many times because eventually Google Play introduced this billing API and would let me have it there unless I had it on there, or some dependency on there. Let's say like a server I was using or a service or API I was using just goes dead, and now that part of my app doesn't work. I was wondering, what similarities do you see between software dying out, so to speak, and a human aging? Because oftentimes with software, it's almost like an organ. It's almost like you were renting an organ for someone and then they stopped allowing that. Whereas in biology, that's not how it works. So I don't really see the connection between software aging and biological aging. So do you have any like examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, so the first version of software was kind of digital clockwork, right? It was the mechanism, but just as pattern, but the pattern was trying to directly map to the mechanism. If this is connected, then the following will get moved or something like that. But now with like the language models, we're seeing kind of more sophisticated things that are self-reflective, self-repairing, more sophisticated versions of software, and we're just at the early stages of that. But if you imagine a piece of software 10 years from now, 20 years from now, even something like a video game, the video game will be able to talk to you about itself. It will be able to explain its code. It will self-generate its own documentation. It will be aware that Google Play Store updated this API call and it will fix itself. Like almost every line of code, you won't get like regular errors because the lines of code will be able to look at their neighbors and say, well, what were you expecting me to do? And they'll kind of negotiate on that. And I think this is what our cells have done. It's a very different kind of biology. It's this kind of dynamic unfolding where they're constantly getting feedback from their neighbors to what to do next. But this idea of like drifting away from sort of where you are, right? So like in navigation, there's this idea of dead reckoning, that if you have like a really good count of your steps and you have like a really good compass, you can close your eyes and know where you are after some amount of time. And this is how sailboats navigate, it's how they got to the moon and back. But the error accumulates, right? You skip one step or your foot catches on something and then suddenly your step count is off, and then that error will accumulate and accumulate. And I think this is what happens with our laptops, that when we go and look for the certain states that we expect the computer to be in, whether it's certain variables or certain drivers or certain states of the network and the disk, if they're how we expect it, then the software can go on. But most software doesn't have the ability to self-correct. And so after 5 or 6 years, you buy a new laptop because it's just not working quite right. And it's weird. And I've been trying to understand this myself because they just kind of slow down. They don't completely just break. They just kind of get sluggish, like someone in their, a geriatric. And so I would think that especially if we look at like evolutionary biology in kind of, prehistory, people had kids at like 13, right? So like at 26, 36, you were an old person, and so the idea, it's kind of the modern world where people started to make it to like 80. And then they were able to feed back, and suddenly you had grandparents teaching grandchildren and great-grandparents teaching great-grandchildren. I suspect this is where a lot of civilization comes from, because you really skipped a gap and you bit the tail to the point where you can actually make knowledge last more than one generation by having it skip like that. But if we think about the evolutionary code, it expects you to have kids at 13 and be kind of almost on the way out by 26. Now you're running that same program to 80, right? It was never run that long, right? It's like your phone in the sun, playing multiple apps, like it's just going to overheat. Like it wasn't designed to run that long. And the same thing when they sell you your iPhone 17, they want you to buy iPhone 18. They're not designing them for longevity. In fact, there's all kinds of weird, interesting things where they cripple them on purpose.
It's also sort of like it's the thing about the parasites are eating the host, in less than one or whatever, right? And it's interesting because it's also like it's what you're doing when you're eating a species of plants that's going to propagate, right? So okay, let's just say you're in a survival situation, you stumble upon a pack of chickens or something. Okay, if you eat all of them, there won't be any. You got rid of all of them. It's done. You have to leave a seed, and I think this literally ties into when the structure behind the idea of a seed. And in biology, a seed round in startups, whatever it is, this idea of this initial kernel that's able to be, that's able to have the distributed system, some aspect of it stored in a very small kind of flexible environment where you can toss it around into all these different places and it can grow. And that's why, like, you know, in a sense, the seed is generalized as to the information it can utilize because it can also survive off of less than optimal conditions. It has far transfer in how it interacts with the environment, and that it doesn't have to only interact with the ground and the fertilizer and the sun and the water and whatever in this one very specific situation, right?
Right.
And I've even heard of things about where seeds can, the seed, you know, how the seed itself can adapt over generations to different kinds of initial conditions and all that. But to your point,
I think that's a great point, because if you think about, like, on an evolutionary scale, they could have just selected for immortality, right? So there's certain trees out there that are thousands of years old. What is it? There's kinds of lobsters or stuff like that. They don't have any natural lifespan. So nature could select for that kind of longevity, immortality kind of thing. But it turns out it's selected for the exact opposite, to start over, to take the best of the code you have, put it into a seed, and just start from scratch. And I think this is like the chaos theory, the sensitive dependence on the initial conditions. Biology is limited. Evolution is limited in the resources it has. And the cell is doing the best it can. And on an evolutionary time scale, it's tried to patch up all of the bugs. But it's not used to running the code 80 years. It's certainly not used to running the code 800 years. And so we need to think about why biology decided to take the seed and start over, right? With offspring and everything else. Not on any current research on self-repairing programs. I think it's something that's super interesting. I've been very interested in evolutionary algorithms and evolutionary programs for genetic algorithms for a long time. And I think those kind of hint at that. But really, we didn't have enough extra computer, right? So to do something like self-repairing, you have to have a computer and then another computer that's watching the computer. And for so long, we were hitting the limits of computers. We maxed out the memory and watching the hourglass and so on. We're just getting to the point where you could run and barely get it to where the computer is running some code, and then some other thing that's called an LLM is watching the code that's running and asking itself, should I run this code? This is important for AI data safety. Like, is this an injection? This is a prompt injection in both senses of it. But just kind of that self-awareness, kind of like in the ancient world, people were too busy surviving to have self-awareness or meta-awareness or metacognition. You didn't worry about, like, how is my life panning out? You were just like eating fruit and running from the tiger kind of a thing. And so I think computers are just at that cusp, and barely, where we can have enough GPUs to watch the first half of the GPUs. And it's kind of like our brain. Our cortex has got to the point where one region of our brain could watch the other, and we could think about thinking, we could listen to our talking, and we could look at what we're looking at. It's not just that we look at the world, we look at it, right? Animals see the world, but they're not like thinking about it. There's no meta in some obvious sense.
I want to ask actually a prediction on that, because I think it's really interesting. Do you think there will be a time, maybe in the next 10 or 20, or given the rate that this is happening right now, maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, that the standard way that software is going to be developed is that there is an LLM that is basically just looking at how is this code performing out in the real world and making changes on that. And the only real software developers that there are just either data scientists or prompt engineers improving that LLM that's coding.
Yeah, 100%. I think software will be considered alive. It will be collections of intelligent agents. It won't just be an LLM. It will be a collection of them. And one of them is kind of the core. The other will be a repair mechanism. Either be a defense mechanism, a debug, diagnostic, documentation. I'm a big fan of Star Trek, and because I think they foresaw a lot of these ideas, particularly with AI. And at one point, there's a character that is an AI. They're just a hologram. And then at some point, they need to do repairs on it. So they turn on another hologram that is itself an agent. It's its own independent AI hologram agent that you can converse with. And its only purpose and goal is to help you debug and repair the other one. And so I think that kind of like Russian doll software, where inside the software is just more software, and inside those is just more agents. I think we will consider them like a living things. They'll operate like committees, and they'll be, operating almost entirely on their own. I think people will participate in them, right? We'll join the committee, so to speak, and I think that will be an interesting thing.
I wonder to that, like, I see a lot of talk around sort of like similar to what you just said, Dr. Hahn, about like the future is almost like bespoke single-use software that the LLM spins up for a specific, right, like for a specific task. And I'm trying to like analogize that to like, or I guess my question is like, how does that way of interacting with the world affect like internal like cognition or like the phenomenology, right? Like I think a little bit maybe about like an octopus that has like this distributed cognition, and like maybe each limb is like doing its own sort of like computations and building its own software to grab this this thing. Like do you think LLMs, those LLMs of the future that you're talking about, will have some sort of like cognition that is more analogous to an octopus or an alien, or like what do you think about that? Is software as a means for
Yeah,
not
it's
just
good.
task completion but like phenomenology also?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think like it reminds me of like Society of Mind that Minsky talked about. I do think that we're going to see kind of like ecosystems of AIs right now. Like ChatGPT is like, I'll answer your question. But something that's almost unheard of now, but will be common and accepted and obvious in the future, is ChatGPT will be like, let me go ask Claude. Right? Whereas now they'd be like, they would never do something like that. But in the future, I think that's the main skill of a human is to know what tools to use, what resources to access, and what humans to talk to. I think the same thing will be true to AI. Like most of the knowledge that an AI will have is what other AI to invoke to ask a particular question. Kind of like a librarian who like knows what region and what book to point to. They're not going to read you the book, but they know where to look.
Or actually, another thing to think about is each organization could have its own LLM based on what its members have been doing. So like maybe Claude will ask the Ecolopto LLM that they have publicly released, which has been basically gathering, like let's say the Ecolopto LLM has been listening to all the Ecolopto hackathons and conversations. And so that LLM is what Claude will actually ask, depending on what it needs. And different organizations have their own public facing LLMs that essentially functions as their like PR public person.
100%. I think that's very soon. I think you're going to see that within 12 to 20 months, where just like every major company has a website, every major company will have a representative, something like a ChatGPT that you can talk to, and it will try to sell you on its products and explain its policies and hire you as an employee and everything else that hyper-organism as a company has a goal for.
Yeah, just to jump in, like that's like explicitly what Project Nanda is doing at MIT right now. Like they're making the marketplace for agents to do that. So like, yes, I think that is whether or not it becomes really meaningful and really, 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 really the economically viable future people want it to be, I'm not sure about yet, and some aren't, but like there's a huge like that is happening now, and there's a lot of hype and like let's do it. So you check that out if you're interested in that for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I was going to just say real quick to everyone who's sort of in Cambridge, Dr. Alon Barinholtz and Volhan are interested in exploring the ecosystem a bit more. So if you know any interesting projects to collaborate on up in Cambridge, could be at the Media Lab, anywhere, let us know. All right, Augustia, go for it.
You guys think? Oh no, I'm waving by.
Oh, okay.
But I do want to talk to someone at some point about training an LLM just on poetry to see what its phenomenological awareness is. Anyways,
that's a great idea.
Awesome, man. Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care. Thanks for the questions.
Awesome. If anybody else has some
this is like a really early question, and it was related. I'm trying to find where I wrote it. It was basically there was a slide about like xenopsychology and all this stuff like that. And I think I was just asking like, are there any projects you're working on or the future that are like xenopsychology or the Levin's sense of like different frameworks for different organisms and social implications of that? I'm just curious about that space, and I'm not doing anything there right now, but I'm curious if people know anything happening there or like plans in the future for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I've just been looking at it from bottom up, trying to look at experimental paradigms. I'm really interested. There's a couple things I've seen recently. Not directly what you're asking, but just popped into my mind. It's sort of these digital chemistry projects. And one of them is called Alien. Let me put it into the chat here.
That also reminds me of Lee Cronin's computation thing, the chemical computer thing as well.
Yeah, so the chemical computer kind of idea. This one, let's see. Oh, good. It was just updated 2 hours ago. So this is kind of explore worlds of artificial life, as they said. Let me put this in the chat here. This one's really neat. It's not quite xenobiology, but it's kind of in that direction. It's to build this digital petri dish, as I call it, and to see what emerges. But yeah, I think this is going to be the thing that the biggest change in AI is going to be in our minds. I think it's not to the technological landscape. It's that's going to change how we think about mindedness and about agency and about intelligence. And I think it's going to open our eyes up to the potential xenobiology that we haven't seen. That's kind of so outside our Goldilocks window that it's too strange to even recognize it.
Yeah, and my final point would be like, I'm really interested, and I'm doing some things with my own, making kind of a future center, future study center for some of these kind of things, but really interested in like the learning across time, or like the civilizational scale learning. Like, how do we get? I think that's basically where we're at. Like, I think right now we're dealing with the reality that a lot of the systemic stuff that's been built over the last 100, 200 years is was short term and operated in very specific environments. And like, we're learning how to have cognition or comprehension, or maybe something like planetary scale, I don't say phenomenology, but just like the experience of being these smaller actors in a broader system, where it's like, okay, we're starting to develop this broader perspective across time, across generations, and we're building languages and models and kind of things for that, because they just don't exist yet. We haven't been able to get There hasn't been a real pressure to target an incentive to do it. And I'm very interested in exploring like that kind of learning, and that kind of perspective shifting. So more about
Awesome.
that.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing. It's kind of the opposite of that ephemeral life. Check out
Yeah.
that Long Now project if you haven't seen it, because I think that's in
Yeah.
that direction.
And I've looked at them before, but I feel like I should give them a different look now that I'm here. So I will do that. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for this
Cool.
opportunity and the wonderful questions. Thanks, Addy, for putting this together. I really appreciate the
Oh,
computational philosophy group, and excited to continue this.
yeah,
next time.
we got to give a shout out to the people who helped us last time as well. Jess was there, Wu Chen, Alistair, Alif. They were all helping in person while I wasn't physically there for the meet. So great job to everyone, and we'll see you all pretty soon. I think some of you can tune in to Dr. Han's keynote at our SF event this Wednesday. Looks like it's going to be
That
pulled
Wednesday.
off pretty good.
Yeah.
And we'll be having more weekly computational philosophy meets as things go on and things build. And thank you, everyone, as always. And we'll see you also hopefully for the hackathon.
All right.
And we're going to post this on Dr. Han's channel, by the way, today's conversation. So make sure you subscribe.
Great.
I'll send it out to everyone.
All right. Well, thank you again, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity.
See you guys.
Talk
Cool
soon.
stuff.
See you, man.
Take
You
care,
bet.
everybody.
Thank you.